Hi everyone, welcome back. Now we're going to start to talk about the nation's slide into war. Now the next major political fight after the Compromise of 1850 will be the controversy surrounding the Kansas-Nebraska Act. And of all things, the subject that will bring up this latest bout between pro and anti-slavery forces will be discussion concerning a transcontinental railroad. Stephen Douglas, a representative from Illinois, the state of Illinois, wants this new proposed railway to come through his home state, to take a northerly route. However, southern politicians would also love for this proposed transcontinental railroad to come through their states because it would generate a lot of income. So in order for Stephen Douglas to get Southern support for a northern branch of this railroad, he's going to have to give up something. And what he will propose will be the KansasNebraska Act of 1854, in which several territories, the Kansas and Nebraska territories, which were still unorganized at this point, what he's going to offer Southerners is the principle of popular sovereignty, that perhaps the Kansas territory or the Nebraska territory might be able to turn into slave states when they came into the Union if you allowed the people there to decide. That's the principle of popular sovereignty, the people's will. So essentially, this act with strong Southern support will pass Congress, just barely, but it will pass Congress. And when it does, it effectively overturns the ban on slavery north of the 36-30 line that had been earlier implemented through the Missouri Compromise, or the Compromise of 1820. So while Southerners are overjoyed, this is the potential for slavery to spread in a region of the country that they never had any hope of it spreading, Northern abolitionist anti-slavery forces are simply infuriated. Both sides now also realize that if the people on the ground will get to decide whether or not these regions become slave states or free states, then they need to get their people out there. They need to get warm bodies out to, in particular, the territory of Kansas. Most people assume Nebraska would come in as a Union state, but Kansas, sitting right next door to the slave state of Missouri, this is going to be the battleground state. We're going to see a tremendous amount of bloodshed erupt in the territory of Kansas. We're going to see a pro-slavery government set up there. We're going to see an anti-slavery government set up there. We're going to see citizens taking matters into their own hands and killing one another all over the issue of whether or not Kansas would ultimately enter as a free or a slave state. Eventually, Kansas will enter the Union in 1861 as a free state, but not without a tremendous amount of carnage associated with this entire process. Also, what we're going to see is individual elected representatives of the nation beginning to take matters into their own hands. In May of 1856, what we see is a northern and a southern politician kind of exchanging words in the Senate, and the very next day, a southern politician by the name of Preston Brooks will storm into the Senate chamber and start beating a man by the name of Charles Sumner, an outspoken anti-slavery force in the Senate chamber. He will beat him to a bloody pulp into unconsciousness, and all of this over not just some personal insults regarding Preston Brooks's family, but also in a bigger sense over the issue of slavery. Things are getting out of hand. Also added to a lot of heated conversations during this time period will be a Supreme Court decision in 1857 regarding a slave by the name of Dred Scott. Scott was originally born in Southampton County, Virginia, the same county that gave us Nat Turner, but he was sold several times to various owners that traveled west with him to places first like Alabama, then to Missouri. Later, he was in the free state of Illinois for some time. Then he was taken to the free territory of Wisconsin. In the end, Dred Scott was taken back to southern slaveholding territory in Louisiana, and when his owner died, he attempted to purchase his freedom from his widow. She refused to sell him, though, so he filed suit, claiming that because he had spent time in a free state, Illinois, and he had also spent time in a free territory, that of Wisconsin, that he should have his liberation at that point in time. Unfortunately, the 9 justices of the Supreme Court in 1850 1856 certainly had a lot of biases regarding slavery. For example, 7 of these highest justices have been appointed by pro-slavery presidents from the South, and of these men, 5 were from slaveholding families themselves. Because of that, these men's sympathies were not too hard to figure out. The decision of the court was read in March of 1857. Chief Justice Roger B. Taney, a Southerner intent on protecting slavery from what he saw as Northern aggression, ruled against Scott. He argued that he was not a citizen and therefore had no right to even bring suit in court. Also, this decision will become controversial because the court will declare that the Missouri Compromise had never even been legal, and that Congress, that the U.S. government had no right to ban the spread of slavery westward. So almost overnight, Southerners are overjoyed. This is what they've been waiting on. They've been concerned that the government might continue to stop the spread of slavery westward. This is welcome news as far as they're concerned. The opposite is true for anti-slavery advocates. This is a deep blow for them, that they are just disgusted. And so what you're going to see is with various presidents not really stepping in to stop the spread of slavery westward, with Congress essentially agreeing not to even talk about slavery all that much through the so-called gag rule. And now with the nation's highest court siding with pro-slavery forces, you're going to see the abolitionist movement, many members of it, becoming deeply frustrated. Thus the career of John Brown, who had always been a very strong, outspoken voice against slavery. He was a veteran of the Kansas struggle. He actually lost 2 sons in Bleeding, Kansas. And he's gotten to the point where he's taking donations and he's developing an idea to incite a mass slave rebellion in the South. So for Brown, he's willing to step outside the bounds of the law, since it seemed like that the law was not going to ever stop the spread of slavery. So his plan to start a revolution began in October or in late 1859, when he and a number of his crew will seize the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry, Virginia. Unfortunately, he chose a place without that many slaves nearby, so word did not spread. He wasn't able to just begin handing out guns and inciting a mass revolt. In fact, the opposite was true. What we're going to see is local whites, alarmed to find out what was going on, quickly surround Harper's Ferry and notify authorities. Federal troops are sent in under, of all people, Robert E. Lee. They will force John Brown to surrender, and he will be tried and found guilty of treason and ultimately executed by hanging on December 2nd, 1859. His last words were among the following, quote, "I, John Brown, am now quite certain that the crimes of this guilty land will never be purged away but with blood." Overnight, he becomes a hero to the abolitionist cause. Overnight, he also becomes enemy number 1 for Southern slaveholders. What we're going to see is a brand new political party emerging by the 1850s. What we've seen is many of the existing parties, in particular the Democratic and the Whig Party, are badly splintered by this point. They're fracturing into a northern anti-slavery wing and a southern pro-slavery wing. So a lot of disaffected members of the Democratic and Whig parties are seeking, those who are seeking an end to slavery want a party that better represents their interests. So by the middle of the 1850s, the Republican Party emerges, and it will be committed to stopping the spread of slavery in the West. Growing rapidly, the party staged its first national convention in 1856, fielding John C. Fremont as their candidate. He did not win in 1856, but they will begin catching the eye of many northern abolitionists who, in the next presidential election in 1860, will choose to rally behind their candidate, Republican Abraham Lincoln, in that election. Lincoln will kind of come to national attention through a series of debates he'll have in 1858 for a Senate seat in his home state of Illinois. He and Stephen Douglas will be arguing about the principle of popular sovereignty, and Lincoln will come out strongly as a voice for preventing the spread of slavery westward. So this is how he will secure the party's nomination for commander-in-chief in 1860. And Lincoln is very clear. He went on to argue that the nation could not exist, quote, half slave and half free, that something had to be done to stop the spread of this institution westward. And against seemingly all odds, winning less than 40% of the popular vote in the national election in 1860, Lincoln will secure the presidency. Not because he has overwhelming support. In fact, he doesn't even appear on the ballot in southern states, but because the other parties were just so deeply fractured, and the vote was split off amongst people voting for one of four candidates, all vying for the presidency that year. Worried now that President Lincoln would move to emancipate slaves, before Lincoln could even be inaugurated to office, South Carolina took the momentous step in December of 1860 of leaving the nation. They decided to secede. They were followed by 6 other Deep South states: Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas. And in February of 1861, these seceded states met in Montgomery, Alabama to create the Confederate States of America. They will choose the figure of Jefferson Davis to be their president. They will choose Alexander Stephens of Georgia to be the vice president of the CSA. How did Lincoln respond? Well, in his inaugural address, he tried to reassure the South that he had no intention, quote, directly or indirectly, to interfere with the institution of slavery in the states where it exists, unquote. In other words, he's trying to reassure these southern states, look, you're blowing this out of proportion. I'm not trying to take slavery away where it already exists. I just want to stop its spread westward. But enough bad blood had built up in recent decades that southern states were not willing to compromise. They were not willing to listen. For that reason, Lincoln also issued a warning. He maintained, quote, the union of these states is perpetual, unquote, and reaffirmed that he would hold the entire nation together and not allow these states to secede. And on his first day in office, his will was tested. One of the few remaining federal installations in the Confederate States of America was Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor, South Carolina. Lincoln needs to send a relief expedition there with additional food and clothing for Union troops there. But the southern states say we cannot have a foreign entity. At this point, they consider the United States a foreign entity since they've pulled out of the Union. We cannot have a foreign entity with a military installation within our borders. So with orders to fire upon Fort Sumter, this is the beginning of the Civil War, April 12th, 1861. When the Confederacy starts shelling Fort Sumter, eventually forcing Union troops stationed there to surrender. At this point, President Lincoln asked for some 75,000 volunteers to stop the rebellion. Also, at this point, 4 states in the Upper South, Tennessee, North Carolina, Arkansas, and Virginia, also decided to secede from the Union and join the CSA. This is the beginning of the end.